took place in the year 1923. It was an experiment, an attempt to capture a likeness of a photograph. A metal disc dotted with nearly 100 small openings was supposed to let tiny beams of light through to record the various shades of the picture. There was no movement, very little contrast. In fact, there was hardly a picture at all. When the image was finally recognizable, it was so small it resembled a flickering postage stamp, but it was a picture, and it was the talk of the day. Some of the picture-producing machines took on almost unbelievable proportions. This artist's conception of one of the monsters gathered a large audience into a Chicago theater in the mid-20s. It was truly a sight to behold, until it crashed through the theater floor. It weighed 1,500 pounds, and it was called a television set. This represents television to many of those who view it from the United States to every country abroad. It's a world of entertainment, of escape from reality, or of self-association. But it is also an industry, and a very high-priced industry at that. And it is also the product of years of labor and experimentation by people whose names are unfamiliar to most of us. The television, as we know it today, is fast-paced, highly departmentalized, glamorous appearing to many. What actually lies behind each sound and picture our homes receive is a story we will hear later. It's a story nothing like the story of television in the earlier days. Nothing like the television of the year 1875. That was when the West was still an infant, a full year before Custer's men were massacred at the Little Bighorn. In Boston, in that year, 1875, a man by the name of C.J. Carey constructed a very crude instrument consisting of selenium cells, each cell connected to a tiny electric lamp. He was trying to capture the outline of an image and immediately transmit that image to another surface. Now, this was perhaps the very beginning of television, although 2 years later a Frenchman came out with a similar invention, which is somewhat better remembered than Mr. Carey's. We're not even sure what name they gave to it then. We do know that later it became known as picture broadcasting and eventually known as television. For those stalwarts of our present day who claim that television should never have been invented, we have this consolation. It is a known fact that man survived for many years, centuries in fact, without television. In fact, there was a time when even newspapers were hard to get. There was absolutely no door-to-door deliveries. Communication was what they craved, especially for those living in the suburbs, or the new lands, as they were called then. Sportsmen were still recognized as sportsmen, long before the first hunting and fishing program ever hit the air. But then, 3/4 of the way through the 19th century, a mild probe was made into the world of television. And then, in 1923, 2 experiments, one in the United States, the other in England, brought the mechanical disc into being. It permitted short scanning of the picture through its many openings. Much of the fuzziness resulted from the fact that the picture was divided into only 30 to 60 lines. This is compared with our present picture, which is divided into 525 lines. From 1923 on, there was a marked increase in the production of vacuum tubes. But in those days, the ends of the tubes were flat, as compared with the convex ends of today's tubes. And unfortunately, the thin, flat surface couldn't take much pressure. As a result, 2/3 of the tubes were breaking before they could ever be used. It was feared that there never would be a large picture. In fact, some of the demonstration sets were so small, the public had to file up to the sets one by one for a look close enough to distinguish what was on the tube. And then, slow though the progress had been, came a further hindrance. The nation was plunged into a depression. There just wasn't anyone willing to invest in picture broadcasting. So the experiment slowed down, as in fact the whole country came to a standstill. But there was some progress. Dr. Vladimir Zworykin began experiments with the cathode ray beam. And 10 years and $4 million later, he had developed the iconoscope. This tube, an integral part of the early cameras, was the main step in changing the light images received in the camera into the easily transmitted electronic signals. Another tube invented at that time, which also converted light into electrical energy, was this odd-looking image dissector. The image dissector was the discovery of Philo Farnsworth. While in his early 30s, Farnsworth was a leader in television development, but he had begun his experiments far earlier, in fact, as a teenager in high school. As the 1930s progressed, the television image became sharper. There was more definition because the picture was being broken into finer lines, from 343 lines for a complete picture to 441. And finally, in the 40s, the picture was stabilized at 525 lines a picture. Television was forced into remote broadcasting early, with sports the main subject. In trying to compete with early productions, the pioneers found their efforts were being compared with the movies of the day, Gone with the Wind, A Boy's Town. There was neither then the experience nor the capital to compete with Hollywood. But television could do something Hollywood could not. Live broadcast. One energetic New York crew even installed equipment in an airplane for a bird's-eye view of the big city. By 1939, the cameras were turned toward the New York World's Fair. Only 1 year before, commercial television sets had rolled off the market. Prior to that, you had to be employed in a television laboratory or know someone who was to have a set. In 1940, the national conventions were the center of television coverage. The Chicago Convention of the Democrats was filmed, but the Republican gathering in Philadelphia was the first to use the newly laid coaxial cable, 180 miles of line from Philadelphia to New York. An estimated 50,000 viewers saw that coverage in 1940. Then, once again, a national disaster. America was plunged into World War II. We all went to war. No more television channels were allowed, as all efforts were turned toward military victory. Only the coastal areas had stations at that time. The television audience was only a handful, so it was radio's task of informing the nation of the immediate changes in the climate. They gathered around their sets for each bit of information. This was radio's finest hour. And then the war ended. Television once again took up the task of building. There were only 9 active stations in 1945, but new channels were allocated and the networks began expanding. It was a dramatic way of tying a nation together, as for the first time the people could watch their president and hear his words of comfort and encouragement. The new space age has brought added importance to all communications media. It is instant coverage as never imagined before. Our troubled world is on display in every country by film and live coverage. The devastating typhoons striking thousands of miles away are laid at the doorsteps of better than 51 million American households having television sets. The inflamed speeches, the debates, the disappointments, the celebrations of the national conventions, the Black Hills of South Dakota, transmitted live to a European audience. The means of communication was the 123rd orbit of Telstar. WCCO television originated the pickup, which was a joint venture of all 3 American networks. 11 cameras were used in this historic undertaking. And for a nation, one of its most tragic moments, the assassination of its president. That day in Dallas, as television covered one of the biggest stories of its life, the man accused of the crime, the nightclub owner who added his bit of live drama. Before the eyes of millions, another killing had taken place. In an unprecedented move, television as well as most radio stations canceled regular programming as the nation mourned. It had all been covered, the tragedy and the installation of a new president. So now we have dealt with the early trials and some of the triumphs of television. Next, a look at the technical side of the medium as well as the complexity of a modern television operation. So they called it television, and we ask why? Logical enough, the Greeks are credited with the word tele, which means far or far off. And who but the French would give us the word meaning to see? Vision, télévision, to see far off. And television is seen far off. Our signal from WCCO television, carried on Channel 4, reaches out approximately 100 miles. Now, this includes 66 counties in Minnesota and Wisconsin, comprising an audience of about 3 million people. Now, you compare that with the 50,000 who were fortunate enough to watch the Republican convention in 1940. Briefly, let's trace this far-off traveling of our picture. First, the image is picked up by the lens of the camera. The image enters as variations of light. This form of the image, then, is recorded on the pickup tube of the camera. The chief function of the camera is to accept this original image and to change it into electrical or voltage variations. Now, these are amplified in the camera control unit as the final job at this particular step. These signals are sent by cable up to studio control, usually within eyesight of the studio itself. Those were $20,000 cameras which we just left, by the way. Here, the switching system is used to select or mix our camera shot with other visual material. Not forgetting our voice broadcast, it follows a parallel but separate path up to studio control. It, too, will travel by cable after being mixed or selected by the audio man. The selection of what is to go on the air lies with the director, who has a variety of cameras, films, and slides from which to choose. Still using cables, the audio and video signals are channeled through master control on another floor. Now, the image doesn't look much like a picture here, but the control of its definition, blacks and whites, is a sensitive part of signal transmission. The transmitter in the Fauché tower is next to receive these electrical impulses, but from here on, they will be changed into radio frequencies and amplified so as to travel at the maximum allowable distance. The antenna atop the Fauché tower beams these signals, image and sound, in our assigned frequency. It will take just a turn of the dial to switch your set on, but you might like to know that your set is responsible for picking up the radio frequencies, changing them back to electrical impulses, and then back to light variations, which is what we started with. Now, if you don't understand this, don't feel too badly. The picture is only an optical illusion. Television has gathered quite a collection of titles in its journey through the years. It has lost some of those which were most complimentary. It has retained many of those which are not quite so nice. Jealousy. Plain jealousy. In some of the earlier years, in the pioneering days, the television cameras were fixed. They were locked in position. They couldn't move around the studio at all. In fact, if two performers were to be on camera at one time, they were so close that their shoulders almost touched, which may or may not explain why such acts as the Mills Brothers and the New Christie Minstrels were so late in getting into television. Possible, not probable. But now the camera angles are quite varied, and the cameras themselves may be moved about the studio at will. The shot can be just as wide as the studio will allow. In fact, one can feel quite lonely at times when everyone takes off and just leaves him by himself. And that reminds us of some of the early days and some of the troubles they had with the first cameras and the first cameramen and the first directors. Now, this particular scene recreated happened on one of the network shows. We'll say that it was Captain Daylight. As his rocket ship sped into space, the camera started to pull back to give us the full view, the full impact of outer space and the feeling of the rocket moving. Oops, a little bit too far there. And another mystery of television is cleared up. Now, this one has happened several times, maybe even more. It involves a telephone call between husband and wife. The wife is all alone at home. She's beginning to hear things. She has called hubby at the office and tells him her fears. Now, he is in the midst of trying to reassure her that no one is there when the sounds in the kitchen startle her, and she says, "Someone is in the house." "Are you sure, wife?" He always calls her wife. "There is someone there. She has no time to escape." There is a scream. He tries to get through to her, but it's no use. The killer has struck. A good ending, but not good enough. The director punched up camera 2, and there's the prop man dangling the phone over the body. This particular happening was fairly close to our own area. It was in a northern station, a new northern station. They had two cameras shooting a love scene. Well, we'll call it a love scene anyway. It involved, as you can see, boy and girl. They sat outside on a fairly bright day, talking of their plans. And all of a sudden, it was dark, and the lightning frightened the girl, and she said, "We'll get wet." "No, we won't," he said. "I have an umbrella." "No, you don't," said the director to himself, "but we'll get it to you." And unknowingly, the cameraman, who had been told to pull back, continued, and we saw the umbrella arrive via the underground. Then there was the story of Dirty Dan, the gambling man. Everyone knew someone would do Dan in, and it happened just before the commercial. The shadow of the assassin appeared, Dan registered shock, and then came the commercial. He had been shot right between the commercial and the second act. Fine. Except that as the cameras came on, the makeup man decided to add a bit more gore. Ah, those were the good old days. Some of the studios are quite large nowadays. Take this one, for instance. In the afternoon, over to my left here, is the Around the Town set. And as we move around the studio, as our cameras will, and I was telling you about the width and breadth of the studio, we pick up some of our familiar sights, the weather boards, and we pan over and pick up the news desk, the baseball scores between, and just beyond the news desk, you'll find Hal Scott and Don Dahl's sports set. Let's just see now what else goes into a television program which come from the studio. Right now, as we saw a moment ago, the Around the Town set looks rather deserted. But every weekday afternoon at 4 o'clock, there is plenty of activity.
The Northwest Salesman Association is responsible for the fact that the Upper Midwest shoppers can depend on finding their local stores well-stocked with the very latest in fashions. This month, their emphasis is on fall and back-to-school wear. We thank them for this preview of our fall fashions.
Long before hostess Gwen Harvey and host Bob Potter came on the air, they were preparing that particular show. One segment of the show, a filmed tour of a local establishment, was done several days in advance. Even the day of the show, the set goes up in the early afternoon. As we said, the image is only light variations, and it takes plenty of light for a television picture. Uniformity of lighting is also essential, and it must be checked each time the set is readied. Even an informal show must have planning. This job is shared by the director and the program's host and hostess. The boom microphone can pick up voices without appearing in the picture. Finally, with the guests readied for their appearances, there is time for a quick conference. The director returns to studio control, from where he has communication with each cameraman. It's 4 o'clock, the cue is given Bob Potter, and Around the Town is on the air.
Will you be eligible in this now, or you are the current reigning queen?
I'm the current reigning queen, and I will be a has-been after Friday.
Oh, I'll bet it. Does it kind of make you sad to come to the end of your reign?
It does.
I'll bet it
It's been
does.
wonderful.
A television station, like any other business, lives or dies by the appearance it presents. The public can judge the station by the people representing it. Personalities such as editorialist George Rice and all-around handyman Don Dahl present fair, but not necessarily impartial reports on various topics. The station's image wouldn't be complete without Axel, a favorite of children and those no longer children. In 1954, Axel premiered the first local color cast over the facilities of WCCO television. Looking something like a good humor man is Channel 4's Don O'Brien, who is preparing his weather map with clouds, rain, snow, and maybe even give us a sunny sky or two one of these days. Sportscaster Hal Scott helps present the most complete coverage of sports in the area. Randy Merriman and his gal everyday Edie Shepard have been friends with our audience for quite a few years. The actual construction of Channel 4 took place in 1948, but its birth was long before that as radio station WRHM in 1935. There have been a few changes. There are now several departments larger than the entire staff of the 1948 operation. Key to the success of this business is its sales department. There are currently some 230 local and national advertising accounts with WCCO. Costs depend upon the amount of time purchased, the day, and the time during which the commercial appears. And they predicted long ago advertisers wouldn't buy on television. A good selling point for the sales staff is the 125 hours of programming offered each week and the potential audience of 3 million. As one of the CBS network stations, it is important that contact be kept with the network, such as this 24-hour-a-day teletype direct to New York. Since a large share of most television is network originated, it's imperative that all network plans are known at our station. Television is almost a community within itself. WCCO television handles all of its own printing, ranging all the way from letterheads to postcards to posters and mailing sheets. Orders from WCCO radio, as well as station sponsors, are turned out in this shop, located on the 4th floor of the station. Within a year's time, nearly 10 tons of paper are printed, cut, bound, and mailed through the station. Creation of possible commercials, as well as illustrations for local programming, fall within the jurisdiction of the art department. It's not always as simple as just drawing something. Most of the time, the final product is a composite of many ideas. Colors are important, too, since they must represent distinct variations of gray. Remember, light variations? The art department draws the plans, and the scenery department carries them out. As new programs are created or old programs revised, the demand is for new background or a set. Now, this happens on the average a good dozen times a year, and in between there's furniture to build and older scenery to touch up. From the promotion department comes the written and visual reminders of programs viewed on Channel 4. And that drawing looks familiar there. In fact, looking closely at this work, it all looks pretty familiar. Well, these people do other work, too. And if you've seen those posters and displays about some of our sponsors' products, chances are they were handled through the merchandising department. It also handles the contests, which I am eligible to enter. So you see, not just putting a picture and voice on the air anymore. It's not the whole point of television. Then there's the money end of it. Expenses mostly, but some coming in, too. But on top of that, there's a payroll for almost 200 people to meet every 2 weeks. There were 26 employees when the station opened. We can't do justice to the engineering department with just one area, but we're going to try. Engineering is the largest single department in the station. This is the videotape room, and this program you're seeing now is on videotape, incidentally, and we'll identify it as such on the closing credits. Are you watching television at the moment? The station needs to know. That's the job of the research department. Not only how many are watching, but at what time, where, what's their background, and are they potential buyers. The sponsor wants to know, and so do we. Dependability is the byword of a successful news operation, no matter what medium of communication you are talking about. For television, the facilities are there, but it's the staff which makes the news operation a success. The combined news, public affairs, and sports staff at WCCO television currently numbers 36. 8 reporters are responsible for 6 newscasts a day. The emphasis is on visual presentation of the news, accounting for 13 cameramen on the staff, working 6 overlapping shifts. The awards, regional and national, which have been given to the newsroom are many, the products of teamwork. Success is often allied with swift movement. For news gathering, it's a must. With photographers cruising in 2-way radio-equipped cars, it's possible to get the fastest action on any story. It was back in 1939 when the mobile units became popular. Today, they are essential to any progressive station. Acclaimed as one of the most complete mobile stations in the country, WCCO television owes this distinction to its 40-foot mobile unit, completely air-conditioned, equipped with 6 cameras, a slide projector, a sound projector for 16-millimeter film, and oh yes, we have a smaller unit too, a videotape machine and ample room for a crew of 12. In addition to its ability to record on the spot, the unit is the origination point of direct live telecast back to the station and on the air. Complete facilities are also handy for complete audio recordings. The unit has already handled numerous assignments for the CBS television network. And perhaps it's best that we stop right there with the latest in live coverage. It seems like such a long time ago when they started working on television. Remember, there were only a handful of stations at the end of World War II. Now there are more than 530 commercial television stations in the United States and its possessions. In fact, in our own area, 92% of the homes have a television set. So they were trying for a picture way back in 1875. They were still trying. In 1920, they finally got it around 1930, and they called it television.